Hello everyone. In this week's lectures, we are going to be discussing the literature of the Heian period in Japan, and so in this lecture specifically, I'll be covering some of the cultural and historical background that will be useful to you as you dive into that literature. Now, I've also posted a more general video I've linked to it in the class YouTube playlist. It's a crash course history video that will give you a more broad overview of the time period. It will probably also be a little bit more effective in some ways just because it will be more visually interesting than one of my lectures. But please do watch this video all the way through. It will not be long because it will give you some specific context for the work that we will be doing. So let's go ahead and get started, and also as a final note, please forgive my terrible Japanese pronunciation. I'm doing my best. So you will want some note-taking materials today, whether that's opening up your Google Doc or getting a notebook. Go ahead and do that now so that you can take some notes. So a brief overview of the timeline of the Heian period. It started around 784 and lasted until 1185. It was considered the last period of, quote, classical Japan. And it was formally begun when the imperial capital was moved from Nara to Heian-kyo, which today is Kyoto. Now, the reason it was moved was mostly like geographical and like climate reasons. The emperor just thought that Nara was too remote and didn't like the climate very much. And this really gives us a little bit of a clue as to what some of the imperial priorities were at the time. They were much less to do with the daily governance of the nation and more to do with the personal comfort of the emperor. So this period was also thought to be the period of peak imperial court life. So up until this point, imperial power had been growing and sort of consolidating and becoming also more insular, so kind of closing off the imperial court more and more from the rest of the country, from the rest of the people, from outside concerns. And over the course of this period as well, the emperor was becoming less of an actual figure of power and more of a figurehead. Now, what happened was that at the beginning of this period, the imperial family began to intermarry with the powerful Fujiwara clan, who then gained power in the court and ultimately turned the emperor into a figurehead while they ruled. So instead of having, the imperial family and then the rest of the aristocracy and then everybody else, what you had was the imperial family as a figurehead while real power laid with the Fujiwaras, and then under the Fujiwaras you had the rest of the aristocracy and then the normal people. The Heian period ended in 1185 with the institution of the first shogunate, and this happened after the Heiji rebellion led by Minamoto no Yoritomo, who was a military figure who kind of got fed up with the way that things were being run by the emperor and the Fujiwaras. So, to get a sense of how we ended up throughout this period, where we ended up, you need to understand some kind of different aspects. And because of the way that the imperial court became more and more insulated from the rest of Japanese life, the actual running of the country became increasingly decentralized. And granted, this period is 400 years long, so this is a long time. But over the course of this period, more people were kind of left to run the country that weren't necessarily connected to the emperor or to the aristocracy. So over the course of this period, military power really started increasing, and a military class developed separately from the aristocracy, which is where we ultimately got that Heiji rebellion and then the shogunate. Over this time period in the aristocracy itself, there was, instead of a focus on running the country, we saw an increasing focus on culture and the arts and, pretty things and nice things and things that had nothing to do with actually governing. Because the imperial court, the Fujiwaras, the aristocracy, were actually terrible at governing. This increased focus on culture, like I said, led to a decreased focus on the minutiae of governance. They couldn't really get anything done, and they didn't really care about the lives of the general population. And one of the most important or influential kind of examples of this is that the imperial government straight up forgot how to issue currency. The, Japanese had used hard currency previously, but over the course of the Heian period, they just straight up forgot how to do it. So we see this playing out both in historical record and in literature. In literature, characters are often paid in like trinkets or like secondhand like kimonos or food or like a trade of services. And then in real life, most transactions ended up being based on the rice trade. So people started using quantities of rice as currency instead of, currency. One of the effects of this was that it put a lot of pressure on the rice trade, which, as you know, the harmful effects of would have trickled down to the rice farmers in a way that the power or influence or wealth would not have trickled down to them in the same way. So this inability to issue currency, this sort of just massive administrative flaw, directly led to the Heiji Rebellion and the shogunate. Other things that were really fallen by the wayside during this time period were a lack of policing and a lack of public services. So you couldn't, go and talk to your local administrator because they were never around, or they didn't know what they were doing, or they didn't have the mandate from the imperial court that they needed. Like highway robbery was a huge problem because there wasn't like a dedicated like policing or peacekeeping force. And the effect of all of this is that real lived experience from this time period for the average people, so, if we went back in time to Heian period Japan, people like we would be, life for us normal folks would have been very, very, very different and probably a lot worse than the lives of the people that we see in the literature. Because during this time period, as well as, just as we've seen in many other time periods and cultures, literature and literacy were very much the domain of the aristocracy. And because of survivorship bias, we tend to believe that the things that the extant literature tells us what life was like for these people in general. When especially in this case, what we're seeing is the experiences of an extremely narrow slice of the population, while the bulk of the population during this time period would have been living a very different life. So, although we know that the lived experience of most people is not accurately reflected in the literature, it is still useful and important to look at the literature of this culture to understand what their ideals were, what kinds of stories were being told, whose story was being told, and what some of their thematic concerns were. Because one of the things that, we've come back to over the course of this semester is this concept of whose story are we being told, whose voices are being heard, and whose voices are being left out. So obviously in Heian period Japan, for the most part, the people whose voices we are hearing are the rich and powerful. The people whose voices are being left out are the rice farmer down the street, normal people. But let's go ahead and talk about some of the actual literature now. So one of the things that allowed for literature and then kind of literary forms to explode during this time period was the development of two new scripts, two new forms of writing. One of them was katakana, which is a simplified simplified Chinese script. Now, Japan had, there had been a lot of cultural exchange between Japan and China. Japan had learned a lot of its literacy and literary styles and forms from China. They had adopted Chinese characters. So katakana was a simplified form of Chinese. But they also developed hiragana, which was a cursive form that was unique to Japan and very tied to vernacular language. So this concept of like an official language or script versus a vernacular is one that we've encountered before. Think back to when we read Beowulf and the other Old English texts, and think about how for most of Europe in that time period, it was considered official or fancier or higher class to do your writing in Latin. So to use Latin scripts, to speak in Latin, to write in Latin. But also remember how for the early medieval English people, remember how they took a great deal of pride in writing in their vernacular language. Think about the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, think about Beowulf, think about the poetry like The Wife's Lament. They love to write and to tell stories using the vernacular language. So in the same way that the early medieval English valued their vernacular, Japan came to really value their vernacular as well, especially kind of ironically in the aristocracy. Now, these new scripts allowed for a greater literacy, especially among aristocratic women. Hiragana was considered a very kind of female way of writing because education for boys was heavily focused on Chinese literacy, on, reading Chinese classics, on learning Chinese ways of writing, learning sort of Chinese law and philosophy, things like that. But increased education for girls was sort of happening across this period as well. Now, this increased education, especially after hiragana was sort of developed, is kind of where that literacy for women stopped, was with these sort of noble artistic and literary forms, and then also learning to write in hiragana. But that being said, it is kind of awesome and kind of notable that across this period, it was considered not just acceptable, but necessary for women to learn how to read and write and create these literary works of art. So everyone at the imperial court and everyone across the aristocracy was expected to be able to write well. Not only were they expected to be able to write well, they were expected to be able to write poetry at least adequately, right? Being able to create literary works, be able to create poetry, be able to recite poetry just off the cuff, being able to perform at like literary salons and literary gatherings was considered really important. Any courtier during this time period, especially a woman, could absolutely make or break their career on the strength of their writing. And that was true especially for poetry, but could also be true for other kinds of fiction or nonfiction commentaries. This could be true for personal writings, for letter writings. And this didn't just stop with the actual content of your text either, but it extended to your handwriting. Having good handwriting was considered an essential skill, and people often judged your character based on what your handwriting looked like. Were you careful? Were you too quick and hasty? Were you sloppy? Were you delicate? They believed that your handwriting really mirrored your personality and your personal values. So you can see how during this time period, there's a lot of stuff going on that's maybe not great outside of, the imperial court, but within the imperial court, it is kind of neat that they're placing not just such a great emphasis on art and literature, but that they're placing such an emphasis on women being able to create these works as well. Now, again, this is, we don't want to take this out of its own context, because they are still operating within very strict gender roles. They are still operating within very, very, very strict social and socioeconomic and class status roles. But it is neat to see this culture that is so dedicated to artistic expression. So these are the two authors that we're going to work with this week. We're going to work with Murasaki Shikibu, and she wrote The Tale of Genji, which is what we're going to read for Monday and Wednesday. she also wrote her own diary. She kept a diary of her time at court, which gives us some amazing insight into what life was like for a member of the aristocracy during this time period. It's awesome. And she also wrote poetry because everybody did. We're also going to read Sei Shonagon, and we're going to get to her on Friday. Her book is known as The Pillow Book, and it's a collection of poetry and anecdotes and like very short pieces of fiction and personal kind of ponderings and thoughts. It's sort of just a general collection of everything that Sei wrote. So in our next video, I'm going to go over a kind of brief biography of Murasaki Shikibu and also some background for the Tale of Genji. Now obviously we're not going to read the entire Tale of Genji, but we are going to read selections from it that I think will give you a better understanding of this time period, its thematic concerns, and what people really prioritized in their literature. So until next time!